Therapists that have cried in a session. Why? I cried when I had to say goodbye to a client of mine who was dying in hospital. We had worked through some pretty challenging things together and he had a huge impact on me, and I felt it was important for him to see that in my tears and words as I said goodbye. I feel like crying reading this. I actually did. I mean, damn allergies. Tears are how we honor those we love. I believe that crying over such things shouldn't be held in. Because those people are worthy of our tears. Not during the session. But I wanted to. I had a teenage client who asked me to listen to their life story, part of the 12-step program they were in. They didn't want me to correct the grammar. Just to tell them if it made sense. It started off with the first time I did drugs. I was 9 years old when my mom and her boyfriend injected me with black tar heroin. I listened patiently, and as soon as we were finished and they left, I cried bitter tears at how cruel people can be. I heard years later that the client was doing terribly. Was a prostitute. And a heavy drug user. Sometimes this field is like staring into the abyss of human suffering. This field is reaching into the abyss of human suffering and hoping you can hold on to whoever you can grab. I say this because you did more than stare into the abyss. You reached out. You tried. And you felt the filth of the abyss on yourself as you tried to pull them to safety. I'm proud of what you did. It's so hard and it's so important. A girl I was friends with years ago had that exact life, with the bonus of willingly, big air quotes around that word, allowing the mum's boyfriend to rape her because getting high was her payment. She's now clean, has 5 children and a steady job. My patient cried and said there's nobody on this planet who loves me anymore. I cried when I left because I knew she was right. For context, she was 95. Her husband and son had died. She had a personality disorder that made her behavior unbearable for her environment after her husband died, and every person still in her life were paid for to be around her. She died a few months after this conversation. That's heartbreaking. Scary to think of living so long that there's just no point anymore. I had a great aunt who lived to 106. She was around to see her daughter die of old age. She said, "I don't know why the Lord wanted me to live so long." Jesus, outliving your daughter in old age. Never thought of that. As a teenager, I volunteered at a nursing home on Sundays. There was an elderly man, in his 90s, physically and mentally healthy, who volunteered at the same time. He did that in part because his son, who was in his early 70s, had advanced stage Alzheimer's dementia. Heartbreaking to think about. Had a sweet little boy tell me about the death of his dad, who was his little league coach, tragically died the week of the big championship game. He went ahead and played the game the day before the funeral. He hit a home run and shared tearfully how the next day, he put the baseball in his dad's coffin at the funeral, with his team all standing around him in support. Hell, now I'm crying again. I'm crying too. That is so heartbreaking. And I'm sure his dad is so incredibly proud of him. Oh, this is tragically beautiful. I'm sobbing at my desk right now. And I'm done with this thread. If it's any consolation, you've got the rest of us crying as well. I was a high school teacher and was called to counsel so many times. One time one of my students 13th was sexually assaulted by an adult male the night before. And her friend told me. I had to call the police mandated reporter, and the school called mom. Mom showed up and basically told her daughter she was a slut. This was her very first sexual experience and abandoned her. I went with her to the police station to file the report. And was in the room for the physical exam. They don't teach you these things in teacher school. My heart broke for her and I was a mess that night and day after. How could a parent do that to a child? I had a student attempt suicide by taking a bottle of her brother's medicine and then get on the bus for school. By the time she got to school, we knew something was wrong and called 911. 9 hours later, I went to the hospital to visit her, and the nurse sitting in her room asked me if I was her mother because her mother hadn't shown up yet. She was in 3rd grade. Well, fuck. I used to be a teacher. It was so hard being exposed to some of the most awful parents on the planet. OMG, this broke my heart. Oh, how awful. The lives some of our students have to survive are so awful and tragic, and it never feels like enough. I've usually cried after sessions if a client has shared some trauma or life experiences that have set them up for a difficult life or feelings of unworthiness. In session, I have cried more when clients share big successes or are graduating from services because they've met goals and such. One example was when a client who struggled with discussing their struggles with mental health due to peer perception at school wrote about their pet passing away for a writing class. In the writing, they shared about how helpful their pet was in coping with their struggles and how losing them had been very difficult. They were so afraid to submit it because it would be the first time they shared about their mental health outside of a handful of people. 6 months later they were on a stage sharing about the same struggles to an auditorium filled with strangers. I cried during both moments. Not a therapist, but I've made my therapist cry a few times. I feel bad when it happens because I can't imagine how difficult it must be for her to hear and stay present to support me in processing. Therapist here. I've gotten misty-eyed a number of times, but only outright had tears for once. My client was very vividly describing the week her newborn daughter spent in the NICU, ending with the day that they knew she would pass. She told me what it was like to hold her baby as she died in her arms. The feeling of grief that filled the air was just too much for me to hold in. So of course a few quiet tears rolled out of my eyes. As a fellow parent whose kid died, these are the only situations where I find it therapeutically beneficial to the client to 1. Disclose and 2. Cry when it feels natural. As a patient whose kid died, I'm sorry to hear you're in this shitty club too. Thank you for helping others. I cried in a substance treatment group. A client's mom had reached out via email to me to say that her daughter died from a nod. She called during my group, so I chose to take the call and spoke with her briefly. I thought I could continue with the group. Ended up in tears instead. The work you're doing is important. My mom and brother would not be around if not for people like you. Focus on the lives saved and keep up the good work. I appreciate you. I cried after I worked with a kid who described an emotionally difficult situation with a sibling. The kid's experience aligned very similarly to something I went through with my own sibling when I was the kid's age, and I hadn't realized how much hurt I was carrying from the experience. Being a therapist sometimes means being confronted with things you didn't realize had such a strong impact on you. Luckily, I have a stellar therapist of my own that I can work through these moments with. Who is the prime therapist that ends the chain of therapy? What burdens must their mind hold? I like to think there are an ultimate group of like 5-6 therapists who all give each other therapy, but none of them know they go to each other for therapy because of confidentiality, and the spread of the burden is just passed between them all. I was working with a deeply depressed client who had a lot of negative self-talk about how she was always a failure. We were exploring the origins of this and how young she was the first time she felt self-blame. She told me her earliest story of when she was in 2nd grade. Afterwards, as we were processing it, I expressed that it wasn't your fault about the story. She just broke down sobbing and said nobody has ever said that to me before in between sobs. It hit me and I cried a little. My therapist cried a little when I told her that seeing her was nearly the only thing I always look forward to. Mine cried a little when I told her she was the closest to a mother figure I had ever had. This is why I entered the field of mental health. Just wanted to be there for someone who felt like no one else ever was. Counselor here. I haven't outright cried, but I have gotten misty-eyed a few times. That's almost crying. Right? We are human also. And if the opportunity presents itself, I usually call myself out and use it as a rapport building statement, as you were telling your story. I was very moved. And that's just from hearing it. I can't imagine what it must have been like to live through it. My counseling teacher does the same. He said he's cried a few times and will usually say something like, "I'm just feeling the emotion in the room." Don't worry. You have to empathize with your client, so it's hard not to get upset sometimes if you're truly trying to connect with them. My boyfriend is a therapist. And some days he offers teletherapy. We both have home offices, so I don't see or hear his sessions. Confidentiality is very seriously protected. But one day, he came out of his office several minutes late, with tears in his eyes. And it was obvious he had been crying. I really wish I could ask him, but I just gave him a hug and went back into my office. The hug is what he really needed. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more Reddit videos.